Joining us now on The Debate, along with Don Cherry, the other great export from Kingston, Ontario, Patricia Rozema, director of I've Heard the Mermaid Singing, Yo-Yo Ma inspired by Bach and Mansfield Park. Cam Tolton, former director of the Cinema Studies program at the University of Toronto. Brian D. Johnson, film critic for Maclean's Magazine. And from TVO's own Saturday Night at the Movies, there's producer and host Tom Ernst. Good to have everybody around the table. I must confess that the reason we're doing this program tonight is because I think 32 years ago, I took, wide shot Michael, his course, Cam Tolton's, at the University of Toronto in film studies, and watched Citizen Kane for the first time, fell in love with the movie, and that's one of the reasons why on its 70th birthday I wanted to have a look at why we still love this film so much. And just to get started, I want to read one of the reviews that came out around that time. This is from The Making of Citizen Kane by Robert Carringer. Tonight, one critic said, I was present at the birth of a new art form, the motion picture, one of the most interesting and technically superior films that has ever come out of a Hollywood studio. Staggering and belongs at once among the great screen achievements. The boldest freehand stroke in major screen production since Griffith and Bitzer were running wild to unshackle the camera. One of the outstanding films of all time. Well, the verdict was in pretty early. And now I want to sort of go around the table here and find out what made this film and makes this film still so great. Get us started. Why did we study this film 3 decades ago that made you think it was so important to study?
Well, first of all, Steve, I'm glad you're still reading Robert Carringer because it's still one of the best sources on Citizen Kane.
Hear, hear.
But Carringer hit the nail on the head. This was, I think, the beginning of modern cinema. It was auteur filmmaking, professionalism. It built on things that had gone before in the history of cinema, but it was a new turn because it was a new kind of iconoclastic filmmaking.
Tom.
Yeah, and I also think that's the reason why it started at becoming one of the best films and noted as the best films, but why it lasts is the history behind it. It's got such a rich story in its making and all the events that happened, how the film was they tried to crush the film, they tried to crush Wells, and it withstood all of that. So history also plays a big role in this.
Brian.
I don't know if it's the greatest film of all time. I would perhaps question that, but it's certainly the most influential film of all time. Certainly since Citizen Kane, there's not another film that's had that kind of influence. I mean, now when you look at it, and I watched it last night for the first time in a few years, it's impossible to watch it without seeing it through the prism of its influences on all the directors you've been watching more recently, whether it's Spielberg or Scorsese or Coppola, De Palma, Kubrick, and this whole notion of the auteur, something the French picked up on when, with the New Wave, when they kind of canonized Orson Welles, that has become kind of de rigueur, the sort of almost godlike auteur with a grandiose and somewhat ironic vision of humanity, and that is still the reigning style in filmmaking. Very male, I might say, as well, but we'll maybe get to that later.
I wonder whether we can add another director's name to that list that you put out there, and that name is Rozema. On the issue of whether or not...
Well, no.
On the issue of whether or not the film obviously was influential to the list he put out, was it influential to you as someone who makes movies?
Well, it was certainly humbling, right? That's his first film. My God, its technical grace actually is, I think, one of the things that really set it apart at the time too. It was so rich on a kind of innovative level, and I mean, about at least 50% of the shots were special effects shots, and so many of the scenes are one-take scenes. They're so graceful, but you have to watch very closely to see all his sleights of hand. I also think the reason it lasts is it bears reinterpretation. It's all kinds of things can be read a multitude of ways. It's not dead clear. It has residual value all the time. Plus, it's about a giant, and it's by a giant. So, we're always attracted, I think especially when you're handing out awards and reviews, you like big. You just like King's speech, not Joe's speech. You like you like the Queen, I mean, obviously there are exceptions, but there is a kind of attraction to the, gods and monsters, and especially if they're combined in one.
Let me follow up on one word you said, though, because I've seen the film. I'm sure all of us around this table have seen it at least 10 times. And you used the word grace, and that was not a word that I would have thought of in describing the film. What about it shows grace?
Well, scene after scene, there are these progressive shots, which, you know, I adore, where the timing is built into the shot. You can't speed it up or slow it down in editing. It's one shot, and it's, you know, a character's. There's that divestiture. That scene where Bernstein and what's his name, Thatcher, are sort of taking the company from him, and it's all in one beautiful shot. You're close on the paper. Paper goes down. You reveal a character. You know, Kane walks away, and it's this crazy optical illusion where he looks like he's in a normal-sized room, and then you realize it's a giant room, and the sound is played with in interesting ways, but it's all so sort of, it just tumbles forward gracefully. It never draws attention to itself, and yet if you watch it as a filmmaker, how the heck do they do this? The deep focus stuff, keeping stuff in foreground in focus and in background, that was all new. It's stuff you want to do all the time, but it's technically really difficult to do.
Let me pick up on that. The deep focus, I remember learning about that in your class. Greg Toland, the cinematographer, the photographer. Why was that considered such an innovation? Stuff in the foreground, middle ground, and background, all in focus.
Well, it had come back into favor only with a few cameramen at the end of the 1930s, and Greg Toland was one of these. It was because suddenly there was a kind of fast film. There was the use of wide-angle lenses, and they narrowed the aperture down just as small as they could. And that was when Greg Toland used it, particularly in Wuthering Heights, and he would use it in The Grapes of Wrath, and then again it comes up in Citizen Kane. So this was a way of keeping everything in focus at the same time. There's that wonderful shot at the beginning of the film where it's not the very beginning, but the beginning of the story of Kane and his childhood. And little Kane is out with his sled, out way, way, way in the distance. And you can see him while all the negotiating is going on in the foreground to try to get the papers in order to send him away and to cut him off from all that has been important for him, like his sled and his mother and his home, Colorado. All of that's going to be gone. And that is just all there in one shot. It was done beautifully, exploited by Toland. But Toland was coming at this really having learned a lot from German expressionist filmmaking.
Those sets would have been blazingly hot too. They would have had to light the hell out of them in order to keep all of that in focus. And also, that shot you're talking about, if you watch the camera, you would have pulled back and a desk would have had to been slid into foreground because the camera couldn't go through the desk. So you've got all kinds of kind of trickery going on behind camera.
Breakaway desks so that the camera would actually move through the desk.
And then slide it back together and then quickly put the actors in there and act like they've been there forever. I mean, it's all, you know.
It's really the first,
grace.
I mean, to me, it's like what started the special effects revolution. You could also think of Orson Welles as being the first, sort of the founder of the 3D movement. I mean, if you think of the way he used perspective, and as you were saying, you know, and in a sense, it's the embodiment of what the film is about, because it's all about hierarchy and you know, grandeur and status, and so all of those sort of lines of perspective and those triangular scenes where there's two people in the foreground, one in the extreme foreground and then another at the end. It's really kind of three-dimensional in a way that cinema had not been before that.
Tom?
And it also created that scene too. It also created a three-level emotional effect as well, just by watching it, because there's the father in between, the mother sitting down at the table, and Kane outside, and he is fretting. So we have the not wanting to happen, the unexpected, doesn't know yet, and the person pushing it through. So you're getting three emotions at the same time. And you know, Orson was a stage director before that, so he utilized a lot of that in when he was directing this film. And I think that scene's a perfect example of how he was able to capture so many levels of understanding of each of these characters in one shot.
Patricia mentioned sound, and I guess if we want to talk sound, we got to talk music. And Cam Tolton, I mean, Bernhard Herman wrote the music and was fantastic, was he not?
And it was right at the beginning of his career. Here he was doing this score, and he had a great advantage there, though, because he was doing it at RKO Studio. And RKO Studio did not have a full orchestra that they wanted to play for all of the film behind the scenes. He was doing it bit by bit, and what he did was He made sure that the kind of instruments were available for the kind of effect he wanted to create at certain moments, so that he could have a special group play for one scene that would have nothing to do with the style of a later scene. So the variety is phenomenal there. Bernhard Herman, of course, who becomes the great composer for the films of Hitchcock later on, and keeps composing right up until 1976, I think it is, when he does Obsession, Brian De Palma's film, which looks very much like a Hitchcock film. And it all goes back to Citizen Kane. Herman was wonderful.
Psycho, his best score?
No, Vertigo.
Vertigo was better.
I would say.
Okay.
So it's the luscious.
It's interesting with the sound, though, too, is given that he's coming from radio, and fresh off his triumph with the War of the Worlds fake news thing, he reinvented the way film deals with sound cues, and the fact that the sound of a scene would come in before the visual cut, things like that. So you could see he was really attuned to sound, not just with the music, but on every level.
Did you ever, Patricia, when you were watching the movie, say, I like that, I'm going to rip that off and use it in one of my films? Did directors do that?
Oh, heavens, yeah.
I guess, does this director do that?
I have not borrowed exactly from Citizen Kane. I didn't study film, so I came to it later. But there were certainly all kinds of tricks, I guess, or effects, or means of making something grander without, having to spend the money, right? I mean, he could do elections and speeches with thousands with, a handful of extras behind him and some cardboard cutout people in a wide shot, and all with sound. He could create the sort of epic feel of a scene. So I've been trying for years to try to get Stone Diaries off the ground, and my thought is, why not give this person, this humble, housewife who's not, invited to the party in any sense, give her a treatment, like a kind of a grand treatment. So I was actually just looking at it with my cinematographer, Doug Coe, and we were looking at the techniques, and it actually, all the low camera, right? He built sets high so he could get the camera low. And for the first time, you were seeing the ceiling in a lot of movies. Often.
Well, Bogdanovich told us in the earlier interview that it wasn't the very first movie to use ceilings, but it was among the first movies to use ceilings. Anyway, because he says everybody says it was the first, but it may not have been actually the first, but it was right up there.
But there's one little thing that I just discovered recently, just after you asked me to do this, was that Thompson, David Thompson, the brilliant critic, he says that no one heard the words Rosebud. In the way it's shot, there's nobody in the room. The nurse wouldn't have heard it.
That's right.
Yes, that's right.
He says it alone.
He says
it
alone.
So how would we have known it?
So So what is this movie? Nobody, everybody's talking about, his famous last word, Rosebud. What does it mean? What does it mean?
Which no one heard.
But which no one heard. So was it that never crossed my mind the first time I watched it, and then after hearing the value of critics, but after hearing him note that, then I just saw storyboards of his first drawings for those opening scenes. The nurse is already in there. The nurse is there. There's no nurse coming in the reflection in the snow globe. So she's already there. You just
storyboarded
cut
it differently from the way they actually shot
exactly.
it.
So I don't know whether that was a change afterwards, because that would have been optically done in post. So anyway, it's fascinating to me.
Tell me this. I think one of the things that I've been trying to get a handle on in reading up about this is how this movie, which, as I said in the opening, kind of opened to underwhelming audiences, great reviews, but underwhelming audiences, and then kind of disappeared for 20 years. How did that get to be number one? Why is this the most written about film ever? How'd that happen? Do you know?
Well, I'd like to say something about the peculiarities of these surveys. And I am wondering if, for most people, Citizen Kane is their personal number one. The surveys are done, and it turns up on the list of somebody's top 50. And it cannot be left off the list of everybody's top 50. And if you circulate that to enough people, it's going to turn up number one. Think of TIFF and what it did this past year. TIFF did
Film Festival.
Yeah. They, for the opening of the Bell Lighthouse, they did a survey of the number one film on two lists one from the public and one from the critics, or the people involved with the cinema world. And the #1 film of essential cinema, as they describe it, turned out to be La Passion de Jeanne d'Arc of Carl Dreyer. Now, I don't think anybody would ever have that at the top of their single list, their favorite film of all time. But if enough people contribute, that's where it turns up. Now, for instance, Citizen Kane is not one of my top 5 or 6 favorite films. It's there among the very top, and historically it becomes important. It would be a sin not to put it on the list because, as I was saying earlier, it's an iconoclastic film that really takes the 2 streams of filmmaking that had been going on in the US at that point and brings them together in the hands of one magician who happened to have a number of excellent collaborators.
Well,
and we can't forget that.
I'm told it's people like you who made it #1 because it disappeared for 20 years, but then, you know, art houses started playing it, university film studies professors started teaching about it, and all of a sudden you've got this new generation of people who are Tom's age who think it's fantastic. Is it on your top 5?
It definitely would be in my top 5. And even though Magnificent Amberson, I think, I enjoy more. I enjoy
also
watching.
A Wells film.
Also a Wells film. And I enjoy that film more. But I cannot watch Citizen Kane without feeling some of its impact. I think someone on the panel said you watch the film and you see everyone else who has been influenced by it since then. And Wells himself, I think, once said in an interview that much of that film is borrowed material anyway. That he has been inspired by different areas, not just film, but different filmmakers, by theater, by radio. So it's, when we talk about collaborators, we're also talking about a collaboration of people that came along that aren't connected by name to the film.
Well, let me try this, because this film was nominated for 9 Academy Awards and won just 1. The film that many people think is the greatest of all time won 1 Oscar in 1941, and it was for writing. And Wells got half of it, I guess. Put us in the time, Brian. What was going on politically, in the air in Hollywood at the time, that this was not the picture that had the backing of the Academy?
Well, if I can just speak to the actual picture itself and why it didn't galvanize the box office. And let's face it, the Academy is often closer to the box office than it is to the critics. And what the film, we talk about all the things the film does do and how great it is. What it doesn't have, I think, is very much sort of emotional impact. This is an intellectual film. This is an aesthetic film. This is a film about media, about politics, about art,
with no happy ending.
About ambition. It's a Faustian kind of fable. It's a fable, and it's a dark fable. I mean, it's interesting in terms of influences. Most recently, David Fincher, the director of The Social Network, basically said that The Social Network is, Citizen Kane as a John Hughes movie. Copying to...
Nice way to put it.
Yeah, sort of kind of co-opting somebody actually coming up with that independently. So I guess what I'm saying is that big hits and also films that resonate with the Oscars have a sentimental pull. This film is about sentiment, obviously. I mean, what could be more sentimental than Rosebud? But it's not sentimental in the least. And when you see it now, you realize it's almost like a graphic novel. I mean, it's so cartoon-like.
It's a bit surreal in that respect.
Yeah, and it's satirical through and through. Whether it's the rise of the newspaper baron, which is the first half of the film, or whether it's the nightmare scenes of a marriage, which is the second half. And it's melodrama in a way. It's comic melodrama to a large extent.
Patricia.
You also have to remember that the Academy Awards are voted by Academy members, and so it is sometimes a little bit of a in-group, and it's sort of Hollywood and Friends of Hollywood. And he, from what I understand, was not the most popular guy. He had way too much power too early. He had final cut when no one else did, and when he was a boy, basically. And I think a lot of people resented him. And I don't think Hollywood does many things very well, but innovation isn't always what it's famous for.
Cam, how much of this is a movie many say about the life of William Randolph Hearst, who did everything he could in his power to make sure this film was destroyed and never shown, and would have had a lot of influence in the movie business at the time, and therefore, if anybody wanted to stay on his good side and keep working, they didn't help this movie that much. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say William Randolph Hearst was certainly the subject of the film. And it came because Herman J. Mankiewicz, who was one of the scriptwriters, had often been invited to the Hearst Castle by Marion Davies and William Randolph Hearst, but particularly by Marion Davies, who
Hearst's
was
girlfriend.
the girlfriend, movie star who had really maintained her rank in the movies thanks to Hearst's influence. And her parallel is Susan Alexander, the second wife of Kane, whose opera career parallels to some extent Marion Davies. The difference is, of course, that Marion Davies had talent and Susan Alexander didn't. But it's certainly true that Hearst did everything he could. He wanted the film to be bought and arranged through various channels to get Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and Louis B. Mayer to buy the film up and then destroy it so that it wouldn't be seen. He didn't want his private life aired in that particular way. So yes, it's all very true, and the story goes, and it's a bit of an interesting story, that Marion Davies' nephew was a film writer by the name of Charles Lederer. Charles Lederer was another boy genius, very much like Orson Welles. And Charles Lederer was shown by Herman J. Mankiewicz the script for Citizen Kane before it was completed. What did he do? He took it immediately to Marion Davies, who immediately showed it then to William Randolph Hearst. So they knew about it early in the game, even before the script was completed. So Hearst sends Louella Parsons, who is his gossip columnist at the newspapers for the Hearst chain, over to the lot to watch the filming of this and find out what he can find out about what was going on. What he finds is a lot of actors and stage crew out playing baseball outside the studio because all of the shooting would stop immediately as soon as Louella Parsons came. So Louella Parsons had very little to report back to William Randolph Hearst, which was all very much too bad.
Now you know why I like taking this guy's film study class 30 years ago. He had the best stories. He had the best stories. But you know, Bogdanovich told us in the earlier interview that, well, you know, William Randolph Hearst clearly was a motivation or was an inspiration for the film. He wasn't the only one. And that we should not, we shouldn't assume he was the sole inspiration for the character of Charles Foster Kane. Having said that, I want to know who wrote this movie. Can you help us with that, Tom?
Well, I believe Mankiewicz did. And
Because there's two credits on it, right?
Yes,
Wells
there
and
is.
Mankiewicz.
Yes, exactly. And then that's always been, you know, debatable as much as whether Citizen Kane deserves to be the best film of all time. Who wrote the script is equally questioned. I believe it was Orson's idea and story, and I believe Mankiewicz gave it life by putting words and scene direction to it.
So he actually would have typed up the script and written the story.
This is only, Steve, a gut feeling. This is only from what I've read and what I've understood and seen other. Well, you know, I mean, part of the issue is Mankiewicz, as big as his name is, he has a lot of credits that don't equal the style and exceptional prose that comes across in Citizen Kane, and I think that is what makes people wonder if he actually did do it. But even a script is a collaborative effort. But I think Mankiewicz deserves to have his name on the screen.
Any truth? Anybody hear any truth? The rumors that Wells tried to have Mankiewicz's name taken off the script, and he wanted to submit it to the Academy under his own name.
Well, certainly the interviews I've read about him, and other people on the panel might have know more. But the interviews I read is that Wells has always been very, very. He gave him a great deal of credit in the interviews, and he's like Mankiewicz, who he called Manky or Mank throughout their friendship, and I think they remained friends throughout their lives.
Pauline Kael weighed in, right? And
She did. She's the one who created it. Yeah.
She created this controversy.
Pauline Kael, I think you're echoing Kael a bit, Tom, when you're talking about that, because certainly after I'd read the Pauline Kael book, I was convinced that Wells didn't write a word of Citizen
Pauline
Kane.
Kael, great film critic from the 1970s.
And I probably was quoting Kael in my class when I was teaching you, because I was so convinced that was the case. But then I've read more since, and there have been enough suggestions that Wells at the same time was taking the script away and adding scenes and making changes, so that it really was, I think, a collaborative effort. But Mankiewicz was writing this thing off in a a special house in Victorville, outside of Los Angeles, where he'd been placed under guard by the producer of the film, John Houseman. And John Houseman was to keep Mankiewicz from drinking. Mankiewicz had broken his leg.
He's
and
fresh
had
from an accident,
been in a
right,
car
yeah,
accident.
yeah.
He was lying up there with his broken leg. And you have Houseman looking after him, and Houseman has the secretary to whom Mankiewicz is dictating the script, a woman by the name of Rita Alexander, as a kind of co-prison guard for Mankiewicz to keep him writing. And he wrote it, gives it to Wells, Wells sends things back, and this is the way I think we have to interpret it finally.
And that was the one Oscar they won.
But that's not to say that Wells at one point didn't have the notion that he had been hired to direct a film, star in a film, write the film, and have final cut on the editing. So the moment when they had a second writer on it, they were breaking the rules of his contract.
Patricia.
Well, and Final Cut allows you to rewrite the film, right? You can you can remove lines, you can add lines, you can shift emphasis in the story. It's almost like a second write when you're editing. He had the power to remove and add. And
Do you have that?
all the time. No, I don't go into any deal where I don't have that.
That's essential for a director.
No, you get that when
I
you're
can't tell.
very,
Are you
very
kidding me?
small. I am kidding you. You get that when you're very, very small, and then when you're very, very huge. And then the rest is like scrabbling in between. No, I guess what I've had that's closest is on Mansfield Park, where you get, if you get above a certain level of approval, of like audience approval and audience tests, then they can't touch you. So I was fortunate enough to have that. So yes, I had Final Cut with Miramax.
Gotcha.
But
Do you remember when you
not
saw
really.
Citizen Kane for the first time?
I was actually, I had already made my first film, and I was in Paris, and I thought, oh gosh, now I might be called a filmmaker. I better know a couple of them. So I went, and Paris had like 350 cinemas playing a lot of American movies. So I saw it there actually, yeah. And you know, I had been kind of chuffed until that point, and then I was entirely humbled and went back to the drawing board.
Tom, you remember when you saw it for the first time?
Yeah, and it was on television, and I was quite young and knew the film's reputation, and it was on very late at night. And so I actually, the only time I've done this, snuck down, turned on the TV, and watched Citizen Kane very quietly.
How old were you?
Oh, 9 or 10.
What's the right age to see it for the first time?
Well, for me, it was 9 or 10.
Really?
Yeah, it had a huge impact on me. I mean, I actually watched it and had some thoughts of why this film is so great. And I've heard that through my older sisters and my parents who talked about the film. And what really threw me about the film, if I may say, was the scene where he brings the song and dance scene. During the meeting, he brings everybody in, he has a celebration, and there's a song and dance out of nowhere, and it seems completely not in tune with the rest of the film. And that threw me off a bit. But other than that, I was really quite engaged by it, and it worked for me.
Brian, when did you see it first?
This is embarrassing. I didn't get around to seeing Citizen Kane until I was in my 30s.
The film critic for Maclean's magazine did not see Citizen Kane.
Steve, just to clarify for the record here, I was not a film critic at the time.
Okay.
I did not become a film critic until a little bit later in life. I was not sort of born a film critic.
Well, then you're forgiven.
I never went to film school. I never studied film. I'm really an imposter. I know nothing about film except what I picked up on the
You don't
fly
have
in
to
the
tell
last 20, 25 years. So I saw it very early on in my career as I sort of segued from journalism into writing about
When
film.
you watched it for the first time?
On a screen at the town cinema. It was, I don't know, must have been some kind of rep deal that they were bringing it around for some reason.
Was it apparent why this film had garnered that much attention when you saw it?
I was knocked out by it.
You were knocked out?
I was knocked out by it. I can't say I was hugely moved by it.
No.
You know, it didn't change my life or anything. I was impressed by it, and I still think that's the thing about Citizen Kane, that because it is the most influential film for better and for worse, in the sense that the notion of spectacle as being the most important thing about film. So much of that stems from the sort of patriarchal template set by Citizen Kane. And I don't want to get all kind of politically correct about it, but you know, while we're on the subject, I mean, you know, the women in the film, I mean, they're kind of grimly portrayed, like from beginning to end. It's just
You get used to it.
you get, no, it didn't make a big emotional impact on me. I mean, the films that changed my life were the films of the new wave, you know, sort of films like, you know, Persona and Blow Up and
I think
those
we
films.
did that one too, didn't we? Blow Up?
We did.
Antonioni? Okay, when did you see it for the first time?
1958. And what you were saying about how it was kept off of the screen for a long time, it had just come back in 1956, and I saw it at the Brattle Theatre in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In 1958, it was one of these things you had to go and see. So I went. It was the time when all of the Bergman films were coming out for the first time in the Brattle Theatre in Cambridge. And in the midst of all of this, they had Bogart festivals and Citizen Kane. And they were all hitting me the same way. They were all brave, new experiences.
It looked like another New Wave film, eh?
Yeah, well, and it looked a bit like Renoir's Rules of the Game.
Yeah.
The whole thing was just hitting me, and I was just letting it roll over me. I wasn't yet a film scholar, I was a literature scholar. So I hadn't yet put all of the pieces together to make them match.
Now, Brian said it was not an emotional experience for him. Was it for you?
It wasn't emotional. No, I was impressed. It was an intellectual experience, academic experience.
Tom?
It seems to be a unanimous opinion that it wasn't emotional, but I was moved by many things. The gentleman talking at the table about the woman with the umbrella. I find that story and that memory just incredibly moving. And I was also moved, perhaps it was my youth at the time, but also moved to almost a point of tears when Susan leaves him and is just going out the door, and he almost wins her back and says the wrong thing.
Right.
And
Have you done that?
Yeah, I was going to say, because he's probably done that.
well, hopefully I've learned from that and did not, but or have not. And but I do feel emotional weight in that film. I do feel
Not
something.
as much as Magnificent Ambersons.
Well, Magnificent Amberson just.
I wept buckets when I saw the Magnificent Ambersons.
I think that's a brilliant, right from the beginning, right from the the opening scene with the snow. I love that film.
And Bogdanovich said Citizen Kane. Wells did not think Citizen Kane was his best movie.
No.
I didn't find it moving either. I actually, this is possibly heresy, but I do think there's a certain amount of groupthink that comes into play when people are doing their lists. You really don't want a kind of a sort of emotionally exposing moment to be put on a list. You want something that everyone agrees on and that you can actually look kind of noble. It's a safe choice for a list, I think.
Here's one question. I teased this off the top, and I have no idea whether we're going to be able to answer it, but he was 25 when he made this movie. How would a 25-year-old have the maturity, gravitas, depth, I mean, put whatever word you want on the list, to make a movie that profound?
He was a prodigy, right? I mean, he was sort of famous already at 10, writing and producing works. And he was, I think he was, you were asking earlier who was the inspiration behind it. I think he was. I think that's part of its power and its grace, is that he was telling his own story, both the dark and the light of it, right?
Yeah, he likes to say that Hearst, inspired it, but he does say that it really doesn't have, once that Hearst inspiration was there. Wells said that really it's pure fiction. There's a line where he says that famous line about Hearst saying, "You make the picture." It's about the war and the Cuban front. He said, "You make the pictures, I'll make the war." That very famous telegram. And Orson Welles said, this can be recognized not only as the true voice of power, but also as a line of dialogue for a movie. In fact, it's the only purely Hearstian element in Citizen Kane. That's according to Orson Welles, long after he had to worry about any kind of legal repercussions. This is late in life. So he constantly tried to disassociate himself from that. On the other hand, Bogdanovich, I think, will say that it's not really sort of a self-portrait either. He'll dispute that, I think. So, but where does art come from? I mean, it's not literally one thing or the other, is it?
Yeah.
Tim?
Well, Wells was told when he was a very small child that he was a genius, and he never stopped believing it. This was good and it was bad.
Beware parents.
So when he was 16, and you say when he's 25, 26, and he's making Citizen Kane, when he was 16, he went to Ireland and presented himself as an experienced actor at the Gate Theatre in Dublin and got himself hired at the Gate Theatre in Dublin. Well, that took nerve, and it was because he had total confidence in himself. And he was right.
But when you make Citizen Kane at 25, what do you do for an encore?
Magnificent Ambersons.
Yeah, which again was not, there's no list of Oscars associated with that picture, and nobody's going to put that on. I don't even think the Magnificent Ambersons makes anybody's top 50 list. At least I haven't seen it on anybody's top 50.
It's on mine.
It's on yours.
Well, I think a great analogy is to Mike Nichols. Mike Nichols, his first film, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf?
Oof.
Now, this is not an original script. This is Edward Albee. This is theater. But here's a guy who comes from theater, just like Orson Welles. If you watch, as I did recently, again, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, starring Richard Burton and the recently late Elizabeth Taylor, you are struck not only by the power of the performances in this, but the incredible sort of Wells-like composition of the scenes. Those sort of triangulated scenes of three people with dramatic perspective. And you thought, this is not just his first feature, this is the first time he's actually laid hands on a camera, not literally because he's got a cinematographer. How did he learn where did he get these tricks from? And a lot of it, I think, comes from theater. You know, Wells, like the whole notion of upstage, downstage perspective, and the very sort of melodramatic kind of, high contrast lighting, that is theatrical. The acting's theatrical, the staging's theatrical. It's not naturalistic, because then after Wells, I mean, we had the whole revolution in naturalistic acting with Brando and James Dean and so on, and everything that produced and is still being felt today. And one thing you do see when you look at Citizen Kane now, you feel, well, the performances aren't natural by and large,
But it's so entirely cinematic, the way he leads the eye.
But it's not.
Yes, it's one take, but you're told where to look at every second. There's never a moment where you could just look anywhere. Pardon me? That's why it's not natural.
That's why it's not natural. That's why it doesn't feel natural. It feels theatrical. Because you're told where to look.
No, I think that's just filmmaking.
I'm giving the director the last word on this one. Seems appropriate for this program. I want to thank everybody for gathering for this discussion about what might be the best 1 hour, 59 minutes, and 16 seconds of film ever made. So, thanks to Brian D. Johnson and Cam Tolton from Maclean's Magazine and the Professor Emeritus, University of Toronto, respectively, Patricia Rozema and Tom Ernst, the filmmaker and Saturday Night at the Movies. Great to have everybody on for the 70th anniversary of Citizen Kane.
Thank you.